On the morning of March 17, 1986, at exactly 6:42 hours, Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov received a radio transmission that would erase him from history. He was flying a routine patrol mission over the Baltic Sea, 40 kilometers west of Kaliningrad, when a voice he didn't recognize came through his headset. The voice was calm, professional, speaking in proper Russian military protocol. It gave him new coordinates. Volkov acknowledged the transmission, banked his MiG-23 fighter jet toward the northeast, and disappeared. The radar station at Baltic tracked him for another 3 minutes. Then the blip vanished from the screen. No distress signal, no explosion, no wreckage ever found. And when investigators reviewed the radio logs later that day, they discovered something that turned a routine accident investigation into a state secret. There was no record of any transmission being sent to Volkov's aircraft that morning. The voice didn't exist. The coordinates didn't exist. But Dmitry Volkov, husband, father, decorated pilot with 9 years of flawless service, ceased to exist as well. This is what remains of his story. The Cold War wasn't fought with invasions and open battlefields. It was fought in shadows, in frequencies, in the space between what was said and what was meant. By 1986, the Soviet Union and the United States had been locked in this silent war for nearly 4 decades. The Berlin Wall still stood. Nuclear missiles still pointed at every major city on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And men like Dmitry Volkov still flew their missions every morning, patrolling borders that meant nothing to the wind but everything to empires. The Baltic Sea was one of those borders, a gray, cold expanse of water where Soviet airspace met NATO airspace, where submarines prowled beneath the surface and reconnaissance planes tested each other's response times. It was a place of constant tension where a single mistake could spiral into something unthinkable. Pilots who flew over the Baltic learned to trust their instruments, their training, and nothing else. Trust was dangerous. Questions were more dangerous still. Dmitry Volkov understood this. He had been trained at the Armavir Higher Military Aviation School, one of the most prestigious institutions in the Soviet Air Force. He graduated third in his class in 1977, was assigned to the 689th Fighter Aviation Regiment based in Kaliningrad, and had accumulated over 1,400 flight hours by the time he turned 32. His record was spotless. His loyalty was unquestioned. He had a wife named Irina, a 7-year-old daughter named Katya, and an apartment in a gray concrete housing block 20 minutes from the airbase. On Sundays, when he wasn't flying, he would take Katya to the beach near Svetlogorsk and let her collect amber pebbles along the shore while the Baltic wind cut through their coats. He was ordinary. He was reliable. He was exactly the kind of man the Soviet system depended on, someone who would follow orders without hesitation, who would serve without complaint, who would disappear without a trace if the machinery required it. But Dmitry Volkov didn't know that yet. On the morning of March 17th, he woke up at 5 o'clock hours, kissed his sleeping daughter on the forehead, drank a cup of black tea in the kitchen while Irina packed his lunch, and left for the airbase in the dark. The streets of Kaliningrad were empty. The snow had melted 2 weeks earlier, leaving behind that particular kind of ugliness that comes with late winter in the Soviet Union. Mud, broken pavement, gray sky pressing down like a concrete ceiling. At the airbase, the routine was the same as always. Pre-flight briefing at 5:45, weather report, clear skies, wind from the northwest at 15 knots, visibility 12 kilometers. Mission parameters: standard patrol flight, vector 180, altitude 8,000 meters, duration 90 minutes. No deviations, no complications. Volkov signed the logbook, walked across the tarmac to his aircraft, and completed his exterior inspection. The MiG-23 was a beast of a machine. Angular, powerful, built for speed and interception. It wasn't graceful, but it was effective. Volkov ran his hand along the fuselage, checking for ice, for loose panels, for anything out of place. Everything was in order. He climbed into the cockpit at 6:30. The ground crew secured the canopy. The engine roared to life. At 6:37, he received clearance for takeoff. At 6:39, he was airborne. The Baltic stretched out beneath him like a sheet of hammered steel. The sun was just beginning to rise over the eastern horizon, turning the clouds pink and orange. Volkov leveled off at 8,000 meters, trimmed the aircraft, and settled into the rhythm of the patrol. His radio crackled occasionally with routine transmissions from ground control, position checks, weather updates, clearances for other aircraft in the area. He responded mechanically, his attention divided between the instruments and the vast emptiness outside his canopy. At 6:42, a voice came through his headset. Berkat 2-3, this is Seagull Control. New coordinates. Vector 045. Maintain altitude. Acknowledge. Volkov frowned. Seagull Control wasn't his usual call sign for ground command. But the voice was clear, the protocol was correct, and the transmission didn't sound unusual. He glanced at his instruments, calculated the new heading, and keyed his radio. Seagull Control, Berkat 2-3. Acknowledging Vector 045. Maintaining altitude 8,000 meters. Confirmed, Berkat 2-3. Proceed immediately. Volkov banked the MiG to the northeast. The new heading would take him closer to the Lithuanian coast, still well within Soviet airspace, but farther from his planned route. It wasn't unheard of for missions to be adjusted mid-flight. Sometimes there were unannounced exercises. Sometimes there were radar contacts that needed visual confirmation. Volkov didn't question it. Questioning orders was not part of his training. He flew on the new heading for 2 minutes. The Baltic passed beneath him, unchanging. The radio was silent. And then, at 6:45, the radar station at Baltic lost his signal. The controller on duty, a young sergeant named Oleg Petrov, stared at the empty screen for a moment, assuming it was a glitch. Radar returns disappeared occasionally over water, especially at low altitudes or in bad weather. But Volkov was at 8,000 meters, and the weather was clear. Petrov tried to raise him on the radio. Berkat 2-3 Baltic Control. Confirm position. No response. Berkat 2-3, do you read? Static. Petrov felt his stomach tighten. He checked his equipment, ran a diagnostic on the radar system, and tried again. Still nothing. He turned to his supervisor, a captain named Sokolov, and reported the loss of contact. Sokolov immediately ordered a full sweep of the area. Other radar stations along the coast were contacted. Air-sea rescue was put on alert. Search aircraft were scrambled. Within 30 minutes, half a dozen planes and 2 helicopters were combing the Baltic, looking for wreckage, for an oil slick, for any sign of Volkov's MiG-23. They found nothing. By midday, the search had expanded to include naval vessels. By evening, divers were checking the seabed near Volkov's last known position. By the following morning, the official conclusion was unavoidable. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure and gone down into the Baltic. His body and aircraft were presumed lost at sea. It was a tragedy, but not an unusual one. Pilots died. Machines failed. The Soviet Air Force had procedures for this. Volkov's wife would be notified. His daughter would receive a state pension. His name would be added to the memorial wall at the airbase, and the investigation would be quietly closed. Except it wasn't. 3 days after the disappearance, a KGB officer named Major Gregory Euston arrived at Baltic Air Base without warning. He carried authorization from Moscow and a briefcase full of documents. He interviewed every controller who had been on duty that morning. He reviewed every radar tape. He listened to every radio transmission. And when he was finished, he ordered all records of Volkov's final flight to be sealed. The official report was rewritten. The cause of the accident was listed as pilot error during routine maneuvers. The search was declared concluded. And Major Euston returned to Moscow with his briefcase, leaving behind a single instruction. No one was to discuss Dmitry Volkov's disappearance. Ever. Sergeant Petrov. The radar controller who had lost Volkov's signal was transferred to a listening post in Siberia 2 weeks later. Captain Sokolov, his supervisor, was reassigned to a desk job in Murmansk. The other controllers who had been on duty that morning were quietly dispersed to different units across the Soviet Union. None of them spoke to each other again. And in a concrete apartment block in Kaliningrad, Irina Volkov received a visit from two men in dark coats. They expressed their condolences. They gave her a certificate of merit for her husband's service. They told her that Dmitri had died honorably, serving the motherland. And then, very gently, they suggested that it would be better for her and her daughter if she didn't ask questions about the details. Irina understood. She had grown up in the Soviet Union. She knew how the system worked. She nodded, accepted the certificate, and closed the door. That night she held Katya while the little girl cried for her father. And she whispered the only truth she had left. He's gone. And he's never coming back. But Irina didn't know the whole truth. No one did. Not the Air Force. Not the KGB. Not even Major Houston with his sealed briefcase. Because the truth about Dmitri Volkov's disappearance wasn't written in any official report. It was buried in a different kind of file, in a different kind of office, far from Kaliningrad. To understand what happened to Dmitri Volkov, you have to understand the nature of the Cold War in 1986. The world had lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation for 4 decades. The United States and the Soviet Union had built enough weapons to destroy civilization 20 times over. They had deployed missiles in silos, on submarines, on bombers circling the Arctic. They had aimed these weapons at each other with terrifying precision. And the only thing preventing total destruction was a fragile agreement that neither side would press the button first. But maintaining that agreement required constant vigilance. It required intelligence. It required knowing what the other side was doing, what they were planning, what they were capable of. And so both superpowers built vast networks of espionage, the CIA and the KGB, the NSA and the GRU, the MI6 and the Stasi. They recruited agents, planted listening devices, intercepted communications, and ran operations that the public would never hear about. One of the most critical aspects of this intelligence war was signals. Intelligence, the interception and analysis of radio transmissions. Every message sent over the air, whether it was a routine weather report or a launch order for nuclear missiles, was a potential source of information. Both sides monitored each other's frequencies constantly, recording everything, analyzing everything, looking for patterns, for weaknesses, for opportunities. The Baltic Sea was a particularly active area for signals intelligence. Soviet naval and Air Force units operated out of Kaliningrad and the Leningrad military district. NATO forces operated out of West Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. The airspace over the Baltic was crisscrossed with radar beams, radio transmissions, and encrypted communications. And both sides had developed sophisticated techniques for intercepting, jamming, and even spoofing each other's signals. Spoofing, the practice of broadcasting false radio transmissions that appeared to come from legitimate sources, was a dark art of the Cold War. It required detailed knowledge of the enemy's communication protocols, their frequencies, their call signs, their procedures. It required expensive equipment and highly trained operators. And it required a willingness to play a very dangerous game. Because if you spoofed a transmission incorrectly, the enemy would know you were listening. And if they knew you were listening, they would change their procedures and you would lose access to their communications. But if you spoofed a transmission correctly, if you could convince an enemy pilot, or submarine captain, or missile operator that they were receiving legitimate orders, you could make them do anything you wanted. This was the capability that NATO had been developing throughout the 1980s. It was called Operation Phantom Voice. And it was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. The operation was run out of a joint NSA-CIA facility in West Germany, just south of the Baltic coast. The facility was disguised as a radar station, but its real purpose was to intercept Soviet military communications and, when necessary, to inject false transmissions into Soviet frequencies. Phantom Voice had been active since 1983, but it had never been used against a live Soviet aircraft. The risk was too high. If a spoofed transmission was detected, it could trigger a major diplomatic incident, or worse, a military response. The operation was intended as a last resort, a weapon to be held in reserve in case the Cold War turned hot. But in March 1986, someone decided to use it anyway. The decision wasn't authorized by NATO command. It wasn't approved by the CIA director or the NSA deputy chief. It was made by a small team of intelligence officers who believed they were operating in the national interest, who believed that the rules didn't apply to them, who believed that the ends justified the means. They called it a field test. The target was chosen carefully. It had to be a routine flight, something that wouldn't attract attention. It had to be over water, where a disappearance could be explained as an accident. And it had to be a pilot with no political connections, no family influence, no reason for Moscow to investigate too deeply if something went wrong. Dmitry Volkov fit the profile perfectly. On the morning of March 17th, at 6:42 hours, the Phantom Voice team transmitted a spoofed radio message on the frequency used by Soviet air traffic control in the Kaliningrad region. The message was carefully crafted to match the syntax, tone, and protocol of a legitimate Soviet transmission. It used a call sign, Seagull Control, that didn't officially exist but sounded plausible enough that a pilot under routine conditions wouldn't question it, and it gave Volkov new coordinates that would take him out of the normal patrol zone, away from other Soviet aircraft, to a position where his disappearance would raise the fewest questions. Volkov, as expected, followed the orders without hesitation. What the Phantom Voice team didn't expect was what happened next. At 6:44, 2 minutes after Volkov acknowledged the spoofed transmission, a second aircraft appeared on NATO radar screens. It was a Soviet Su-15 interceptor, flying low and fast from the direction of the Lithuanian coast. The Su-15 closed on Volkov's position at supersonic speed. And at 6:45, exactly 3 minutes after the spoofed transmission, Volkov's MiG-23 vanished from both Soviet and NATO radar. The Phantom Voice team watched in horror as the radar blip disappeared. They had expected Volkov to fly the new heading, realize something was wrong, and return to base. They had expected confusion, maybe an investigation, but nothing that would directly implicate them. They certainly hadn't expected a second Soviet aircraft to intercept and, based on what the radar showed, shoot down one of their own pilots. The implications were immediate and terrifying. If the Su-15 had been scrambled to intercept Volkov, it meant that Soviet air defense had detected the spoofed transmission. It meant they knew that someone had penetrated their communications. It meant that Phantom Voice had been compromised. And it meant that the Soviet Union had responded not by raising diplomatic protests or launching an investigation, but by eliminating the evidence. They had killed their own pilot to hide the fact that their communications had been breached. Within hours, the Phantom Voice operation was shut down. The facility in West Germany was evacuated. The equipment was destroyed. The personnel were reassigned to posts around the world, with strict orders never to discuss what had happened. The few records that existed were classified at the highest level and buried in archives that would remain sealed for decades. And Dmitry Volkov became a ghost, a man who had existed, who had flown, who had disappeared, but who had never officially been targeted, never officially been killed, never officially been anything more than an unfortunate accident. The Soviet Union never acknowledged what had happened. The investigation was closed. The records were altered. And the officers who had ordered the Su-15 to intercept Volkov were quietly rewarded for their discretion and their ruthlessness. They had protected the state. They had eliminated a potential vulnerability. And they had sent a message to NATO. We know what you tried to do, and we will not hesitate to sacrifice our own people to keep our secrets. This is the architecture of the Cold War. Not grand battles or heroic sacrifices, but small, cold calculations made by men in windowless rooms. A spoofed radio transmission, an interceptor launched in secret. A pilot who followed orders and died for reasons he would never understand. Dmitry Volkov was not a hero. He was not a traitor. He was not even a casualty of war in any traditional sense. He was simply a man who flew in the wrong place at the wrong time, who became a data point in a classified operation, who was erased because his existence had become inconvenient to empires. In the years that followed, the truth about Dmitry Volkov's disappearance remained locked away in two separate vaults, one in Langley, Virginia, and one in Moscow. The men who knew what had really happened carried that knowledge like a stone in their chest. Some of them retired, some of them died. Some of them woke up in the middle of the night, decades later, thinking about a radar blip that had vanished over the Baltic Sea, and wondering if they could have done something different. But the Cold War didn't stop to mourn Dmitry Volkov. The missiles remained pointed at each other. The submarines continued their silent patrols beneath the oceans. The espionage continued, more carefully now, with new protocols and new encryption. And the world kept turning, indifferent to the small tragedies that occurred in the margins of history. In Kaliningrad, life continued as well. Irina Volkov received her widow's pension to 120 rubles a month, enough to survive but not enough to live comfortably. She kept working at the textile factory where she had been employed since before her marriage, operating the same loom, producing the same gray fabric that would be turned into military uniforms. She never remarried. She never spoke about Dmitry, except in the most careful terms, always using the official story. He had died in a training accident, a mechanical failure, nothing unusual, nothing worth investigating. Katya grew up with a ghost for a father. She had memories, vague, fragmentary things that faded with each passing year. The smell of his leather jacket, the sound of his laugh, the way he would lift her onto his shoulders and walk along the beach while she pointed at seagulls. But as she got older, these memories became less like actual experiences and more like stories she had been told. Narratives constructed from photographs and her mother's careful silence. She learned not to ask questions. In the Soviet Union, questions were dangerous. Questions led to attention, and attention led to problems. So Katya became quiet, obedient, unremarkable. She did well in school. She joined the young pioneers. She learned to recite the proper phrases about the greatness of the Soviet state and the nobility of sacrifice. And she learned to bury the anger that sometimes surfaced when she thought about her father, anger at him for leaving, anger at the system that had taken him, anger at the silence that surrounded his death. By the time she turned 18 in 1997, the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Cold War had ended. And Katya Volkov, now a university student in Moscow, found herself living in a country that was trying to forget everything that had come before. The statues of Lenin were being taken down. The KGB headquarters had been renamed. The archives were being opened, slowly, reluctantly, but opened nonetheless. And Katya decided to look for answers. She started with the official records. She went to the military archives in Moscow and requested her father's file. It took 6 months of paperwork and bureaucracy. But eventually she was allowed to view a sanitized version of his service record. It contained the basic facts: his training, his assignments, his commendations. And at the end, a single paragraph describing his death. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov was killed on March 17, 1986. When his aircraft experienced mechanical failure during a routine patrol over the Baltic Sea. His remains were not recovered. He is remembered as a loyal officer who served the Soviet Air Force with distinction. That was all. No details. No investigation report. No explanation of what kind of mechanical failure could cause an aircraft to simply vanish without leaving any wreckage. Katya wasn't satisfied. She contacted the Baltic Air Base, now part of the Russian Air Force, and asked if they had any additional records. They told her that most files from the 1980s had been destroyed or lost. During the chaotic years after the Soviet collapse, she contacted veterans organizations and found a few men who had served with her father. But they all told the same story. Dmitry was a good pilot, a reliable officer, and his death was a tragedy, but not a mystery. Mechanical failures happened. The Baltic was cold and deep. Bodies were lost. It was simply the risk of the profession. But one of the veterans, an older man named Victor, who had been a ground crew chief at Baltic, mentioned something that caught Katya's attention. He said that after Dmitry's disappearance, there had been a KGB officer who came to the base and interviewed everyone. And after that officer left, several people had been transferred very quickly, including the radar controllers who had been on duty that morning. Katya asked Victor if he remembered the KGB officer's name. Euston, Victor said, frowning as he tried to recall. Major Gregory Euston. I remember because he scared the hell out of everyone. He had that look, like he could see right through you. He interviewed me for 2 hours asking about your father's aircraft, about the maintenance records, about whether there had been any problems. And then he just left, and we never heard anything more about it. Katya wrote down the name. Major Gregory Euston. She had no idea if he was still alive or where he might be, but it was the first real lead she had found. It took another year of searching, but eventually she tracked him down. He was living in a small apartment in St. Petersburg. Retired from the FSB, the successor to the KGB, and surviving on a meager pension. He was 73 years old, his health was failing, and when Katya knocked on his door and told him who she was, he looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between guilt and relief. "I've been waiting for someone to come," he said quietly. "I knew someone would, eventually." He invited her in. The apartment was cramped and smelled of cigarette smoke and old books. Euston moved slowly, carefully, as if every step caused him pain. He offered Katya tea, and they sat across from each other at a small kitchen table covered with a faded cloth. "I can't tell you everything," Euston said. "Some things are still classified. Some things I don't fully understand myself. But I can tell you that your father's death was not an accident." Katya felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean?" Euston lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "In March 1986, I was assigned to investigate the disappearance of Senior Lieutenant Volkov. At first, it seemed routine, a mechanical failure, a crash over water, nothing unusual. But when I reviewed the radio logs, I found something strange. Your father received a transmission that morning, redirecting him to new coordinates. But when we checked with air traffic control, they had no record of sending that transmission. So where did it come from? That's what I was supposed to find out." Euston took a long drag on his cigarette. "We analyzed the transmission. We compared it to known NATO signal patterns. And we concluded that it was a spoofed radio message, a fake transmission, designed to make your father believe he was receiving legitimate orders." Katya stared at him. "NATO did this?" "We believe so. We had intelligence that the Americans and their allies had been developing this capability for years. And this appeared to be a test. They wanted to see if they could successfully redirect a Soviet pilot using false orders." Ustin's voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were reading from a report. "But there was a complication. When your father changed course, our air defense detected the anomaly. They saw that he was deviating from his flight plan without proper authorization, and they made a decision." "What decision?" Ustin looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were gray and tired. They sent an interceptor, a Su-15 from the base at Palanga in Lithuania. The pilot was ordered to shoot down your father's aircraft before he could leave Soviet airspace. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Katya couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The words didn't make sense. "They killed him?" she finally managed to say. "Our own military killed him. They eliminated a security threat," Euston said. "That's how it was classified. Your father's aircraft had been compromised. He was following false orders. They couldn't risk him being captured or his plane being recovered by NATO. So they made the decision to neutralize the situation." "He was following orders," Katya said, her voice rising. "He didn't know they were fake. He was doing his duty, I know." Ustin's voice was almost gentle. "I wrote that in my report. I said that Lieutenant Volkov had acted correctly based on the information he had. But it didn't matter. The decision had already been made, and my job wasn't to question the decision, it was to make sure that no one ever found out what really happened. So, you covered it up. I followed my orders." Euston stubbed out his cigarette. "I sealed the files. I had the radar controllers transferred. I made sure the official report listed mechanical failure as the cause. And I carried that knowledge for the rest of my career, knowing that a good officer had been killed not by the enemy, but by his own side." Because the system valued secrecy more than it valued his life, Katya felt tears running down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm dying," Houston said simply. "I have maybe 6 months left, and I'm tired of carrying other people's secrets. Your father deserved better. You deserve to know the truth. Even if there's nothing you can do with it. Did anyone else know? Did the pilot who shot him down know?" The pilot was given orders. He followed them. That's all he knew. He was probably told it was a training exercise or a defector or something else that would justify the action. The pilots were never told the full story. That was too dangerous. Only a handful of officers in Moscow knew what had really happened. And all of them are dead now, except me. Katya sat in silence for a long time. Outside the window, St. Petersburg continued its daily rhythm. Cars passing, people walking, life going on as if none of this mattered. And maybe it didn't. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union was gone. Dmitry Volkov had been dead for more than a decade. Nothing could bring him back. Nothing could undo what had been done. But Katya needed to know one more thing. "Was there anything else?" she asked. "Any other detail you can tell me? Anything that might explain why they chose him specifically?" Houston shook his head. "It was random. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. NATO chose him because he was flying alone, over water, in an area where a disappearance wouldn't raise too many questions. And our military killed him because that's what the system did when it felt threatened. There was no grand conspiracy, no personal vendetta, just bureaucracy and fear." Katya stood up. She felt hollow, exhausted, as if all the energy had drained out of her body. "Thank you for telling me. I'm sorry," Houston said. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." She left the apartment and walked through the streets of St. Petersburg for hours, not seeing anything, not thinking anything coherent. The truth she had been searching for was worse than she had imagined. Her father hadn't died in an accident. He hadn't died fighting the enemy. He had died because 2 empires were playing games with human lives, and he had been unlucky enough to become a piece on that board. Katya never published what she had learned. She considered it. She thought about going to journalists, about demanding that the Russian government acknowledge what had happened, about making sure the world knew that Dmitry Volkov had been murdered by his own country. But she knew it would be futile. The files were still classified. Houston would deny everything if officially questioned, or more likely would be dead before any investigation could be completed, and the Russian government in the late 1990s had no interest in revisiting the crimes of the Soviet era. They were too busy trying to build a new country on the ruins of the old one. So Katya kept the truth to herself. She finished university, became a teacher, and eventually married a man who worked as an engineer in Moscow. She had 2 children, a boy and a girl. And when her children were old enough to ask about their grandfather, she told them the official story. He was a pilot who died in an accident, a brave man who served his country. She didn't tell them about the spoofed radio transmission, or the Su-15 interceptor, or the KGB cover-up. What good would it do? The Cold War was history. The people responsible were dead. And her children deserved to grow up without the weight of that particular truth. But she never forgot. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when her family was asleep, she would take out an old photograph of her father, the one where he was standing in front of his MiG-23, young and confident, smiling at something outside the frame, and she would think about what he must have felt in those final moments. Did he know something was wrong? Did he realize the orders were false? Did he see the Su-15 closing in on him? Did he have time to be afraid, or to think of his wife and daughter? Or did it happen so fast that he never understood what was happening? She would never know. No one would ever know. That was the final cruelty of the Cold War. It didn't just kill people, it erased them. It turned human beings into classified files, into redacted documents, into numbers on a casualty report. And the truth, when it finally emerged, was always incomplete. Always filtered through bureaucracy and secrecy. Always tainted by the knowledge that someone had made the decision to hide it in the first place. Major Gregory Houston died in September 1999. 6 months after his conversation with Katya. He was buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of St. Petersburg. Fewer than a dozen people attended the funeral. Katya was one of them. She stood at the back of the small group of mourners, listening to the priest recite the prayers. And she thought about how strange it was that this old man, this former KGB officer who had spent his career keeping secrets and enforcing silence, had been the only person willing to tell her the truth. After the funeral, she placed a small stone on Ustin's grave, a Jewish custom she had learned from a friend. It was a way of saying, "I was here, I remember. Your truth mattered." And then she went home, back to her ordinary life, carrying the knowledge that her father had been killed not by the enemy, but by the machinery of the state he had sworn to serve. The Phantom Voice operation remained classified for decades. The few documents that survived were buried so deeply in the archives that even historians with top-level clearance couldn't access them. The officers who had run the operation scattered to different posts, different countries, different lives. Some of them felt guilt, some of them felt pride. Most of them simply felt nothing. They had done their job. They had followed orders, and whatever had happened to the Soviet pilot was just another casualty in a war that never officially existed. In 2006, 20 years after Dmitry Volkov's death, a former NSA analyst named Robert Marsh published a memoir about his time in signals intelligence during the Cold War. The book was heavily redacted before publication, with entire chapters blacked out by government censors. But in one brief passage that survived the redactions, Marsh mentioned an operation conducted in the Baltic region in the mid-1980s. An operation that had gone catastrophically wrong and had resulted in unintended consequences. That led to the immediate shutdown of a major signals intelligence program. He didn't name the operation. He didn't provide details. But he wrote, "We believed we were testing our capabilities in a controlled environment. We didn't understand that the other side was willing to kill their own people to protect their secrets. That was the moment I realized that the Cold War wasn't a game of chess between rational actors. It was a meat grinder, and the people being ground up were the ones who trusted their governments the most." The passage received almost no attention. The book sold poorly. And Marsh died 2 years later from lung cancer, taking whatever else he knew about Phantom Voice to his grave. In 2014, nearly 3 decades after the incident, a Russian military historian named Alexei Kuznetsov was researching Soviet Air Force accidents during the Cold War. He came across a reference to Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov in a partially declassified document from the Baltic Air Base archives. The document noted that Volkov's aircraft had disappeared under unusual circumstances, and that the investigation had been transferred to KGB oversight. Kuznetsov was intrigued. He requested the full investigation file, but was told it was still classified and would remain so for at least another 50 years. He tried to interview veterans who had been stationed at Baltic in 1986, but most of them were dead, and the few who were still alive claimed they didn't remember anything unusual about the case. Kuznetsov eventually abandoned his research and moved on to other topics. But he included a footnote in his book about Soviet military aviation. There are dozens of cases like Lieutenant Volkov's, pilots who disappeared under circumstances that were never fully explained. Investigations that were sealed, families that were told to stop asking questions. The Soviet military machine consumed its own people as readily as it consumed its enemies. And the full truth of what happened to these men will probably never be known. He was right. The full truth about Dmitry Volkov's death exists in only 2 places now, in a sealed file somewhere in the Russian military archives, and in the memory of an aging teacher in Moscow who never told her children what really happened to their grandfather. This is how the Cold War worked. Not with grand battles or dramatic confrontations, but with small, quiet acts of violence hidden behind walls of classification and bureaucracy. Men like Dmitry Volkov died in the silence between official statements, in the gap between what happened and what was reported. They died because empires needed secrets more than they needed to acknowledge the humanity of the people who served them. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed. The archives were opened, partially, reluctantly, incompletely. And the world moved on, congratulating itself on having survived the Cold War without nuclear annihilation, without ever fully confronting the thousands of smaller deaths that had occurred in the shadows. Dmitry Volkov was not the first person to be killed by his own side during the Cold War, and he was not the last. He was simply one more name in a long list of casualties that will never be fully counted, never be fully mourned, never be fully understood. He woke up on March 17, 1986, kissed his daughter, drank his tea, and went to work. He followed his training. He trusted his equipment. He obeyed his orders. And for that, for doing everything the system had taught him to do, he was erased. The radio transmission that redirected him came from NATO. The missile that killed him came from the Soviet Union. But the real killer was the Cold War itself, that vast, paranoid, merciless machine that ground up lives and spit out classified files and taught everyone involved that secrecy was more important than truth, and survival was more important than justice. If stories like this make you pause and reflect on how easily human lives become expendable in the machinery of states, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories buried in archives, stories of people who were caught between empires and crushed by forces they never fully understood. Stories that should never be forgotten, even if they were meant to stay secret forever. Because the Cold War ended 30 years ago. But the instinct to hide uncomfortable truths, to classify, to redact, to transfer people who ask too many questions, that instinct never dies. It just changes flags and waits for the next conflict, the next crisis, the next moment when someone in power decides that one person's life is less important than maintaining the illusion of control. Dmitry Volkov deserved better. So did the thousands of others like him, the pilots, the soldiers, the agents, the civilians who were caught in the wrong place at the wrong time and became footnotes in someone else's classified operation. We tell these stories not to glorify the Cold War, but to remember that behind every redacted document, every sealed file, every official lie, there was a person. A person with a name, a family, a life that mattered. And the least we can do, the very least, is refuse to let them be forgotten.